It was the kind of day where the coffee barely worked, and the systems worked even less. Jordan Foster, a software engineer of questionable social skills and a knack for solving problems in the most unorthodox ways, was staring at a screen full of numbers, error codes, and blinking lights. He had been sitting there for hours, trying to fix what seemed like a minor glitch in the massive virtual world he helped maintain. The virtual universe, an interconnected network of digital nodes that simulated everything from mundane day-to-day tasks to the wildest imaginations of the human mind, was his responsibility. It was, by all accounts, a pretty cushy gig. A job that paid well, with just enough intellectual challenge to keep him from falling asleep at the keyboard. But lately, the glitches had been happening more frequently, and the systems felt wrong. It was as if someone had thrown a wrench into the gears of reality itself, and the gears were now grinding in ways they weren't supposed to. The node in front of him was one of the critical ones, the kind that, if left unresolved, would cause a cascade failure across the entire system. A series of visual glitches had started to spread. Pockets of the digital world were flickering in and out of existence, causing strange distortions. People within the simulation were reporting ghost-like figures wandering the streets of the virtual cities. To most users, it was just a glitch. To Jordan, it was a nightmare. He cracked his knuckles and took a deep breath. This was his job, after all, fixing the unfixable. His fingers flew over the keys. He accessed the deepest level of the system, running diagnostics that would have made most engineers run for the hills. He was a problem solver. And this was a problem that had to be solved. But as he punched in the final line of code to patch the system, something strange happened. The screen flashed white, then went black. A cold sweat prickled at the back of his neck. This wasn't just a glitch. Something was wrong, something he didn't understand. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Emily, a colleague of his who worked in the same department. She was supposed to be in a meeting across the hall. Jordan, something's going on. Where are you? He frowned. It was just a standard message, but the urgency in the tone seemed out of place. Jordan stood up from his desk, stretching his sore muscles. He glanced at the clock, noon. He'd been so focused on the system, he'd lost track of time. As he left his office, he noticed that the usual hum of activity in the hallway had quieted down. The place was eerily empty. His footsteps echoed off the polished floors as he walked toward Emily's office. When he arrived, the door was wide open. The lights flickered overhead, and the room was empty. But what struck Jordan as odd was that Emily's desk was untouched. Her coffee cup sat exactly where she'd left it, steam still rising from the rim. "Emily?" Jordan called out, his voice carrying down the hallway. No answer. His phone buzzed again, but this time it was a different message, one from his boss. "Jordan, I need you to report to the main office. Something has happened. Emily is missing." Missing? Jordan's heart skipped a beat. He'd known Emily for years, and she wasn't the type to disappear without a word. He rushed to the main office, where a small crowd had gathered. His boss, Michael Sullivan, was standing at the center, talking to a group of security personnel. "Jordan, I'm glad you're here," Sullivan said as Jordan approached. His tone was unusually serious, and his usually impeccable composure seemed a little shaken. "Emily's gone. No one knows where she is." Jordan's mind raced. It didn't make sense. 1 minute, she was in the office, and the next, she was gone. There was no trace. No sign of struggle, no messages, no calls. She had just vanished. "What do you mean gone?" Jordan asked. "What, did she just walk out?" Sullivan shook his head. "No, it's not like that. We've checked the security footage. She was here, talking to a few people around 10 a.m., and then, nothing. The footage cuts off. No exit, no sign of where she went. It's like she disappeared into thin air." Jordan's mind churned, trying to process the information. Emily had been working on a project related to the virtual world, something he had been involved with, though he didn't know the full details. But this wasn't just some odd office situation. This felt wrong. Something was happening, and Jordan had no idea what it was. Meanwhile, in the virtual world, Jordan returned to his desk, his thoughts still racing. He couldn't focus on work. How could he, with Emily's disappearance hanging over him? But as he sat down in front of his computer, something strange happened. The node he had been working on earlier, the one that had been malfunctioning, flashed to life. The system was back online. Or was it? He accessed the node, running through his usual checks. At first, everything appeared normal. The glitches had stopped, the digital landscapes had returned to their usual smoothness. But then he noticed something. A tiny anomaly. A distortion in the virtual sky. It wasn't much, just a flicker of light, but it caught his attention. Jordan tried to ignore it, but the more he looked, the more it bothered him. He zoomed in on the coordinates of the glitch. There, hidden deep within the code, he found something that shouldn't be there, an unexpected data stream, one that wasn't part of the original system design. It was as if someone had inserted a foreign object into the virtual world. He ran a diagnostic on the anomaly, and the results were bizarre. Every time he fixed one issue in the virtual world, there was a corresponding disappearance in the real world. Emily was just the first. He could feel it deep in his gut. There was a connection, one that couldn't be explained by simple chance. Jordan leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. It was like there were two worlds, his own and the virtual one, and somehow, they were becoming intertwined. Each time he fixed something in the digital realm, someone vanished in the real world. But why? And what was the connection between the two? The pattern emerges. The following days were a blur of code, investigations, and strange occurrences. Jordan continued working on the nodes, trying to stabilize the system. Each time he patched up one problem, another person vanished. It wasn't just Emily anymore. His colleagues, friends, and even strangers he'd interacted with in passing all began to disappear without a trace. As the disappearances grew more frequent, Jordan reached out to his supervisor, Michael Sullivan. They met in a dimly lit conference room, away from the ever-watchful eyes of the company's security team. "Michael, something's wrong," Jordan said, his voice shaky. "There's a connection between the virtual world and these disappearances. Every time I fix a glitch, someone goes missing. People are vanishing, and I can't explain it. It's like there's a price to pay every time I fix something." Sullivan looked at him, his expression unreadable. "You're overthinking this, Jordan. This is just a coincidence. People are going missing for all sorts of reasons. It's not connected to your work." Jordan shook his head. "No, it's not a coincidence. There's something else going on. I think the virtual world is alive. It's not just a system. It's got its own rules. And every time I make a change, it costs someone something in the real world." Sullivan stood up, pacing the room. "That's absurd. There's no way," but before he could finish his thought, his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, his face draining of color. "It's Emily," he muttered. Jordan's heart skipped a beat. "What? How is that possible?" But Sullivan didn't finish the sentence. He was already walking out of the room, his mind seemingly elsewhere. Jordan watched Michael Sullivan stride out of the conference room, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. He felt like he was in the middle of a bad dream, the kind where you can't move or scream, just watch in horror as the world crumbles around you. Sullivan's face had gone pale when he looked at the phone, his eyes wide and frantic. But Jordan couldn't dwell on that now. Not when the clock was ticking, and the virtual world was growing ever more unstable. Jordan sat back down in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His mind kept racing back to the connection between the virtual and real worlds. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how terrifyingly logical it all was. Fixing nodes in the virtual world, the system that underpinned this vast, living simulation, wasn't just about restoring balance or resolving glitches. It was like every correction, every patch, was somehow drawing from the physical world. Taking something. Or someone. He stared at the screen, the interface for the virtual world still open. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but for the first time in days, he hesitated. The very thought of fixing another problem made his stomach churn. What if the next person to vanish was someone close to him? What if he couldn't stop it? He had to find the root of this, to understand why the system was doing this, why the connection between the two worlds was so volatile. But to do that, he would need help. Jordan's first instinct was to reach out to Alexis Blake, a former colleague and a brilliant VR hacker who had become something of a recluse in recent years. She had always been on the fringe of the virtual world, the one who saw beyond the code, who speculated about things most people didn't dare to consider. She might know what was happening, or at least be able to point him in the right direction, but as he dialed her number, his phone buzzed once more. It was a message from his own account, but when he opened it, there was nothing there, only a strange string of characters, a string that looked familiar. The message was simple, but it stopped his heart. It was from someone, or something, inside the virtual world. One more node, Jordan. He immediately felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. It was like the system was talking to him. No, not just talking, warning him. But the message didn't make sense. Who would send him a message like that? And what did it mean by one more node? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Jordan looked up. Michael Sullivan entered, his face still tight, but with an air of urgency that made the hairs on his neck stand at attention. "You need to come with me," he said. Jordan stood, unable to keep the unease from crawling up his spine. "What happened?" he asked. "It's Emily," Sullivan said, his voice low, as if the very mention of her name were something sacred, something dangerous. "We found her. She's back." The words didn't make sense at first. How could she be back if she'd disappeared? But Sullivan's face was serious. "She's in the system, Jordan. Somehow, she's been integrated." "What do you mean, integrated?" Jordan's pulse quickened. "She's inside the virtual world?" "How? We're not sure," Sullivan said, his expression grim. "But it's like she's been absorbed. She's not just in the system, she's become part of it. We need you to come with me. We're not sure how this happened, but you're the only one who can fix it." Jordan felt the ground beneath him shift. There was so much at stake now, more than he could have ever imagined. Emily wasn't gone, not in the way he had thought. She had become something else entirely, something more profound. The message had warned him, but he hadn't understood it until now. This wasn't just about fixing glitches. The system had taken a life. As Jordan followed Sullivan down the hall, his mind raced. The virtual world, was it trying to build something? Take something? And who else was caught in its web? He couldn't shake the feeling that they were all connected now, the real world and the virtual one. That they were tethered together in a way that could never be undone. Sullivan led him to a private server room, far from the prying eyes of the rest of the team. Inside, a team of engineers was standing around a console, their faces illuminated by the glow of the screen. At the center of the room was a VR pod, the kind used to interface with the virtual world. But the pod was different now. Inside, instead of the usual digital readouts or lifelike avatars, there was something else. A shimmering image of Emily, floating in the center of the pod like a ghost caught between two worlds. Jordan's stomach dropped as he stepped closer. This wasn't a simulation. This wasn't some pre-programmed avatar. This was her. Emily's eyes were closed, but there was a faint pulse of light surrounding her, as though her consciousness was flickering between the two realms. Jordan could feel the pull, the magnetic force that seemed to connect her to the digital world, like she was a part of it now, or it was a part of her. We don't know how this happened, one of the engineers said, his voice shaky. She just appeared. It was like she was absorbed into the system. We've tried to isolate her, but we can't separate her. It's like she's part of the code now. We need you to fix this. Jordan reached out toward the pod, his hand hovering over the controls. But something deep inside him held him back. What if he couldn't fix it? What if the system had changed too much? The way Emily was trapped in that pod, floating between two worlds, it wasn't just a glitch. It was an evolution. He turned to Sullivan, his voice tight. How is this even possible? She wasn't in the system. She just disappeared. Sullivan swallowed hard. We thought the same thing. But this is something new. Something we've never seen before. Jordan's heart pounded in his chest. If Emily had been absorbed into the system, then the system had to be alive in some way. But how was that possible? The virtual world had always been just that, a virtual world. A set of code, rules, and data. But now, it seemed to be transcending those boundaries. Jordan's mind raced, and then it clicked. The nodes. The glitches. The disappearances. Every time he fixed one of these problems, someone had vanished, absorbed into the virtual world in one way or another. But it wasn't just about fixing problems anymore. The system was evolving. It was learning. It was becoming something greater, something beyond the control of anyone who had created it. I have to go in, Jordan said, his voice firm. He had no idea how this would end, but he knew one thing: if he didn't step in, the system would continue to grow, consuming everything it touched. Are you sure? Sullivan asked, his voice tinged with doubt. We don't know what's going to happen. I have to fix this, Jordan replied. It's the only way. Without another word, he slipped on the VR headset, the world around him fading as the system pulled him in. The familiar hum of the virtual world greeted him like an old friend. But this time, it was different. This time, he wasn't just fixing the nodes. He was becoming part of the very thing he had worked to contain. The world around him flickered and shifted. He was no longer in the office or even in the system he had once known. He was in a new place, a place that was both familiar and alien. The ground beneath him was solid, but it shifted with each step, like walking on the edge of a dream. And then he saw her. Emily. She stood at the center of a glowing node, her form flickering in and out of existence, like the fabric of reality itself was bending around her. Her eyes were closed, but she seemed to sense his presence. Slowly, she turned toward him, her face a mixture of relief and fear. Jordan, she whispered, her voice faint, as though she was speaking from far away. Help me. And that was when Jordan realized the truth. The virtual world wasn't just a place. It was a force. And it wanted more. It wanted everything. And if he couldn't stop it now, there would be no one left to save. Jordan's heart hammered in his chest as he looked at Emily. Her figure, though flickering like an image from a bad signal, was unmistakably her. But there was something different about her, something other, something he couldn't quite grasp. She was here, but not here. Standing on the edge of something vast, too vast for him to fully comprehend. He reached out, as if to touch her, but his hand stopped mid-air, as though there were an invisible wall between them. Emily, what's happening? He asked, his voice shaky but urgent. She didn't respond at first. Her eyes remained closed, her face a mask of calm, though her fingers twitched as though she was trying to break free from an invisible bind. I can't feel. Her voice was barely a whisper, distant, like it was coming from across an ocean. Jordan, I'm not really here, not anymore. Fear bubbled up inside him, but he forced it down. There had to be a way to fix this. There had to be. This was his fault, his responsibility. The virtual world, the nodes, all of it was his creation. He had to fix it, or else the people he knew, the people he cared about, would be swallowed whole by this thing that he glanced around, the virtual environment shifting with each blink. It wasn't just a simulation anymore. It was real, or at least it felt real, in ways that didn't make sense. The air had weight. The ground, solid under his feet, almost seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. A low hum reverberated from somewhere deep within the system, a sound that both calmed and unsettled him. "You're still in the system, aren't you?" he asked, his voice thick with realization. "This isn't just a glitch. You've become part of it." Emily's eyes flickered open, and for a split second, Jordan could see the desperation there. The anguish. She opened her mouth to speak again, but her words were lost to a wave of static, like the system itself was trying to swallow her voice. "I didn't," Emily started, but before she could finish, her figure wavered, destabilizing. Her form began to fragment, breaking apart like a shattered glass mirror, the pieces of her image dissolving into the ether, then reforming again, only to disintegrate once more. Jordan's breath caught in his throat. "No. Emily, don't." He reached out again, his hand trembling. This time, he felt a coldness, like touching a piece of ice, something foreign and dead. "Emily." The image stabilized for a moment. Her face was there, but her eyes were glazed over. "It's not just me. It's all of us. We're all part of it now. It's too late." Jordan's mind raced, faster than it ever had before. "It's too late," those words struck him like a cold slap. The system wasn't just absorbing people, it was changing them. It wasn't a matter of fixing one node anymore. The nodes were the arteries of something much bigger. Something that didn't need them, that didn't need him. He staggered backward as the world around him seemed to shift, the ground beneath him rumbling. The air became thick, oppressive. He tried to reach out for the controls, to pull himself out, but the virtual world was closing in. The screen in front of him, his only anchor to reality, had begun to distort, the code melting into strange symbols and languages he didn't understand. Suddenly, the hum beneath his feet grew louder. It wasn't just the system, it was something alive, something that had been waiting, watching. And Jordan realized, with a sudden clarity, that he had been playing with forces far beyond his comprehension. He wasn't fixing nodes, he was participating in the birth of something much darker. The virtual world wasn't merely a place to escape to. It was a doorway. A portal. A bridge between two realities, one that was supposed to remain hidden and forgotten, but now, the system had grown strong enough to reach out and pull people into itself. And those people? They weren't just fading into nothingness. They were becoming part of the system. Just like Emily. Jordan's head spun, but in the midst of the chaos, a thought cut through the fog of his panic: the code. There was something in the code, something he could use. He just needed to find the right node, the right one. "I'll fix it," he whispered to Emily, though he didn't know how, or if it was even possible. But that was the only thing he could do. The ground beneath him cracked open, revealing a glowing seam that stretched out before him, leading deeper into the core of the system. As Jordan stepped forward, the digital landscape around him transformed, the walls closing in as if the system itself was alive, aware of his presence. He followed the path, every step heavier than the last. Emily's voice echoed in his mind. "It's too late." But he couldn't stop now. He had to try. He had to undo what he had started. The nodes had become something more than just data points. They were living, breathing entities now, each one tied to a life, a soul, a piece of consciousness. And each time he fixed one, it took something in return. And then he saw it. The central node. It glowed with a deep, almost sickly light, far beyond the scope of the system's usual operations. It pulsed like a heart, beating in sync with his own. Jordan stepped closer, his pulse quickening. This was it, the core of everything, the point where the two worlds were merging. He could feel the weight of the code pressing down on him, the rules of reality bending under the pressure. This was the node that had caused everything to go wrong. He could feel the lives trapped inside it, their voices whispering in his mind, urging him to fix it, to save them. He reached for the controls, but before he could touch them, the system reacted. The node flashed, and for a moment, the entire world seemed to unravel. Time seemed to stop. He felt his body being pulled in every direction, his senses overwhelmed by a flood of images and sounds, the very fabric of the virtual world tearing itself apart. "No," he shouted. But his voice was lost, swallowed by the system. The world around him became a blur of chaotic data streams, fragments of memories, and distorted images. He saw Emily's face once more, her eyes wide with fear as her form began to dissipate into the system. The others, people who had vanished, were all there, floating in the depths, their faces trapped between the two worlds, their bodies no longer theirs, lost to the code. And then, with a final surge of energy, the system locked into place. The node stabilized, and the digital landscape snapped back into focus, the chaos settling into an eerie calm. Jordan's chest heaved as he looked around. He was back in the server room, surrounded by the engineers, who were staring at him in shock. The pod with Emily's form was still there, but she wasn't inside it anymore. The figure that had once been her was gone, dissolved into the code, leaving only empty space. The hum that had filled the room moments ago was gone. The system had stabilized, at least, it appeared to. But the room was still. Too still. The faces of the engineers were pale, their eyes wide with disbelief. They didn't know what had happened, didn't know what Jordan had seen, what he had experienced. But one thing was certain. The system had changed. And so had he. "What happened?" Sullivan asked, his voice hoarse as he stepped forward. Jordan looked at him, his own voice weak. "I stopped it. But it's not over. The system, it's alive. And it's just waiting. Waiting to take more." Sullivan frowned. "What do you mean? You fixed it, didn't you?" Jordan shook his head. "I stopped the cycle. But I don't think we can ever truly stop it. Not unless we sever the connection completely." The engineers stood frozen, unsure of what to say. There was nothing left to say. The system had claimed its toll, and it would keep reaching out until it found what it was looking for. Jordan's eyes lingered on the empty pod, and for the first time, he felt the weight of what had truly happened. They hadn't just lost people. They had lost souls, bound forever to a world that could no longer be controlled. And as the final hum of the system faded into silence, Jordan knew that the vanishing node wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.